In mid-June 1944, just days after the brutal landings in Normandy, an unsettling procession marched back toward Omaha Beach. Hundreds of German soldiers in Wehrmacht uniforms were returning to the exact sectors they had just fiercely defended, but they carried no weapons, instead holding picks and shovels under the strict guard of American military police. These captured prisoners were deployed to perform the most agonizing duty of the war, digging graves for the American troops they had just killed. It was a jarring, unnatural juxtaposition. Why would the American military trust its recently defeated enemy with such a sensitive and sacred task? The answer lay in a massive logistical paradox and an unprecedented pledge. The United States military had made a solemn promise to the American public. No fallen soldier would be left behind, and no one would be buried as an unknown if humanly possible. But on the beaches of Normandy, that bureaucratic, moral commitment violently collided with the chaotic reality of a fast-moving front line. Combat units simply could not halt their advance into France to bury their own dead. The invasion had to maintain its momentum. This immense burden fell entirely on the Quartermaster Graves Registration Service. Tasked with honoring this promise in the middle of an active war zone, they were severely understaffed and quickly overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the casualties. How could a drastically outnumbered logistical team build an enormous forensic tracking system on a continuous battlefield? And why did relying on the grueling physical labor of the defeated enemy become the only viable way to fulfill a sacred promise and save thousands of American identities? To understand how this sacred promise nearly collapsed, we have to look at the staggering geographical reality of the Normandy beachhead in the days immediately following June 6th. The American sectors had been secured, but the physical cost of the breakthrough was scattered across miles of hostile terrain. Thousands of American casualties lay exactly where they had fallen. The geography of this battlefield was a logistical nightmare. Bodies were dispersed across 5 miles of tidal sand at Omaha and Utah, tangled in thick concertina wire at the fortified draw exits of Vierville and Les Moulins, submerged in the deliberately flooded marshes of the Murderette River, and hidden deep within the dense, ancient hedgerows of the Norman Bocage. The combat units fighting their way inland, including the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, along with the airborne regiments, operated under strict, unforgiving tactical imperatives. They had to push forward aggressively to link the beachheads before German panzer divisions could mount a coordinated counterattack. Stopping to properly recover and bury their fallen comrades was an operational impossibility. The living had to abandon the dead to maintain the critical momentum of the invasion. The monumental task of recovery was handed over entirely to the Quartermaster Graves Registration Service companies, specialized units like the 603rd and 604th, which had landed directly behind the assault waves. Before the invasion, War Department planners had drafted precise, clinical manuals for these quartermaster units. A standard Graves registration company, consisting of just over 100 men, was expected to systematically locate, identify, process, and bury the casualties of an entire division. The standard procedure required them to secure identification tags, carefully inventory personal effects into standardized canvas M1 bags, record exact map coordinates, and excavate temporary individual graves. But the planners in Washington had envisioned a conventional, linear battlefield. They completely underestimated the sheer density of the slaughter on the beaches and the disjointed, chaotic nature of the airborne drops inland. By the end of the first week, the Graves registration units were facing a complete systemic collapse. The administrative math simply did not work. Establishing temporary collection points near the beach, these few dozen specialized quartermasters found themselves completely overwhelmed. They could not physically dig hundreds of regulation-depth graves in the hard, root-choked Norman clay using only hand tools, especially while operating under sporadic enemy artillery fire and sniper harassment. The physical toll of excavating a single proper grave took hours. Doing it hundreds of times was beyond human endurance for such a small force. The situation rapidly escalated into a desperate race against time and nature. The unusually warm summer heat of mid-June accelerated decomposition at an alarming rate, rendering visual identification increasingly difficult. Furthermore, the battlefield was not static. Continuous German mortar and artillery barrages, repeatedly churned the terrain, threatening to permanently bury the fallen under layers of blasted earth and debris. If a soldier's dog tags were separated from his uniform by blast impact or lost in the thick, clinging mud of the flooded zones, recovering his identity became a complex forensic nightmare. Every passing hour meant a higher probability that an American soldier would be permanently erased from the records, designated forever as an unknown. The quartermasters on the ground realized they were standing on the edge of a bureaucratic and moral catastrophe. The only way to clear the rapidly growing backlog, secure the personal effects, and preserve the identities of the fallen was a massive, immediate influx of raw, manual labor. But they were trapped in a severe manpower vacuum. General Omar Bradley's First Army was fighting a desperate, grinding war of attrition in the hedgerows. Every single able-bodied American soldier, engineer, and support clerk was critically needed on the firing line to sustain the offensive. The military could not pull combat troops off the front to dig graves, and the quartermasters could not physically move the earth fast enough on their own. The entire identification system was about to fail, unless the American command could find a captive, highly disciplined workforce, numbering in the hundreds, immediately. The solution was staring at them from behind the newly erected barbed wire enclosures dotting the Normandy coast. Thousands of German soldiers, captured in the brutal fighting around the beachheads, were sitting idle in temporary holding pens. American command made a purely pragmatic, yet deeply uncomfortable calculation. Under the terms of the 1929 Geneva Convention, detaining powers were legally permitted to utilize enlisted prisoners of war for non-combat labor. Digging graves fell firmly within those legal parameters. Orders were swiftly issued, and hundreds of Wehrmacht POWs were marched out of the stockades, handed heavy picks and shovels, and directed toward the steep bluffs overlooking Omaha Beach. On the ground, this legal directive created an intensely volatile atmosphere. These were not anonymous laborers. Many of these prisoners belonged to the 352nd Infantry Division, the very troops who had manned the concrete bunkers and mortar pits, pouring fire onto the American landing craft just days prior. Now they were excavating the final resting places for the men they had killed. The American military police guarding them stood with their weapons locked and loaded, their fingers resting perilously close to the triggers. The fragility of this forced cooperation was immense. One sudden movement, a single smirk, or any perceived gesture of disrespect toward an American casualty could have instantly triggered a lethal retaliation. To maintain absolute control and protect the integrity of the burial process, the quartermasters instituted a rigid, non-negotiable division of labor. The German prisoners were restricted entirely to the brutal physical exertion of earth-moving. They swung the pickaxes, cut through the stubborn roots, and excavated the long, uniform trenches in the hard Norman soil. But they were absolutely forbidden from touching the fallen. The American graves registration personnel retained exclusive, meticulous control over the actual casualties. Only American hands were permitted to search the uniforms, secure the crucial dog tags, inventory the personal effects, and process the forensic paperwork necessary to guarantee an identity. With these rigid boundaries drawn, this grim logistical machinery finally began to turn on the windswept heights above the channel. But as the convoys of supply trucks began returning from the inland hedgerows stacked high with the dead, no one anticipated the sheer, horrifying industrial scale this operation would rapidly assume. The designated focal point for this immense undertaking was a flat stretch of coastal plateau near the village of Colleville-sur-Mer, which would rapidly evolve into the St. Laurent Temporary Cemetery. Situated just above the bloody draws of Omaha Beach, this piece of high ground had been fiercely contested and secured by American infantry only hours earlier. As the 2.5-ton trucks began grinding their gears up the steep, muddy dirt roads from the shoreline, their beds loaded with canvas-wrapped casualties recovered from the sand, the quartermasters initiated a meticulous, emotionally draining assembly line of administration. This operation was not merely about the rapid disposal of the dead to prevent disease. It was about securing an unbreakable bureaucratic chain of evidence. It was the only way to guarantee that a family sitting in a living room thousands of miles away in Ohio or Pennsylvania would eventually know exactly what happened to their son. The procedure dictated by the Graves Registration Service was clinically precise, specifically designed to strip away the overwhelming chaos of the battlefield and replace it with absolute, undeniable order. As a casualty was carefully laid out on the Normandy grass, the American clerks stepped forward to conduct a thorough forensic inventory. They systematically emptied the mud-caked pockets of the fallen. They extracted heavily worn wallets, crumpled black and white photographs of wives and children, waterlogged letters from home, rosaries, pocket knives, and lucky silver dollars. These deeply personal items were carefully sealed into standardized canvas M1 effects bags. Every single item had to be cataloged on official War Department forms with unwavering accuracy. The absolute linchpin of this entire identification system centered around a pair of stamped metal discs. The standard-issue dog tags were the most critical asset on the battlefield for the quartermasters. The clerks would locate the tags, which were often secured around the casualty's neck on a beaded chain or taped securely to their canvas webbing to prevent metallic rattling during combat patrols. One tag was carefully unclasped and permanently attached to the canvas pouch containing the personal effects, ensuring that the soldier's belongings were inextricably linked to his official military record for transport back to the War Department. The second tag remained exactly where it belonged, permanently affixed to the remains. This built-in redundancy guaranteed that when the time came for a permanent reburial years later, the body would carry its own undeniable physical proof of identity. For the quartermasters, executing this procedure was an agonizing daily routine. They were young men themselves, often the exact same age as the combat infantrymen they were processing. They were forced to read the names, look at the family photos, and confront the intimate, heartbreaking reality of the sacrifice, all while standing only yards away from the silent German prisoners who had caused it. While the Americans exclusively handled the sensitive paperwork and the personal effects, the sheer, crushing physical exertion of the operation fell entirely on the captive workforce. Under the oppressive heat of the unusually warm Norman summer, the German prisoners were ordered to break the earth. This was not a matter of simply digging shallow, random holes in a field to hide the casualties. The War Department demanded architectural precision and deep respect, even in temporary resting places. The graves had to be excavated to exact military specifications, uniformly spaced, perfectly aligned, and dug to precise regulatory depths. The hard, root-choked clay of the coastal plateau fiercely resisted the shovels. The German POWs, many stripped to their undershirts and sweating profusely, worked in grim, exhausting silence. The rhythmic thud of pickaxes striking subterranean stone and the harsh scraping of spades against the dirt became the persistent, unending soundtrack of the St. Laurent Heights. American military police officers paced the perimeters with Thompson submachine guns and M1 Garands, their expressions hardened, strictly enforcing both the perimeter security and the grueling pace of the manual labor. The layout of the temporary cemetery required perfect geometry. The quartermasters staked out long, flawless rows using surveyor's string and wooden pegs, ensuring that every trench lined up with mathematical accuracy. For the prisoners, the labor was excruciating. Blisters ruptured and bled on their hands, and the physical toll of digging grave after grave, hour after hour, pushed them to the absolute limits of their endurance. Yet they dug without complaint or resistance. The strict segregation between the American clerks handling the bodies and the German soldiers moving the earth was rigidly and aggressively maintained. The POWs were permitted only to prepare the ground, and once the Americans had carefully lowered the canvas-shrouded casualty into the trench, to shovel the heavy Norman soil back over the top. The visual impact of the site began to change rapidly. What had been a contested, ordinary French field was systematically transforming into a vast, sprawling grid of freshly turned earth, marked by hundreds and then thousands of temporary wooden crosses and stars of David, each bearing a meticulously stenciled name and serial number. For the first few days of the operation, the psychological atmosphere among the German prisoners was defined by a sullen, underlying arrogance. Many of these men were seasoned, combat-hardened veterans of the Wehrmacht, who had been deeply indoctrinated by years of wartime propaganda. They had been repeatedly assured by the German High Command that the Atlantic Wall was an impenetrable, invincible fortress. Even though their bunkers had been overrun and they had been captured, a persistent, desperate belief circulated among the POW work details that their captivity would be incredibly brief. They whispered among themselves that elite panzer divisions were undoubtedly marshalling just a few miles inland, preparing a massive, coordinated counterattack that would inevitably smash the fragile American beachhead and drive the invaders back into the sea. They genuinely believed they were digging graves today, but would be liberated by their own advancing armor tomorrow. However, the specific geography of the Saint Laurent Cemetery provided an unintended and devastating vantage point that began to fracture this illusion. Because the burial grounds were situated high on the bluffs directly overlooking Omaha Beach and the English Channel, the German prisoners had a continuous, unobstructed, panoramic view of the American logistical buildup. As they paused to wipe the sweat from their faces and lean heavily on their shovels, they looked out over the water and witnessed a spectacle that completely defied their comprehension and contradicted everything they had been told. The horizon was entirely obscured by the greatest armada in the history of human warfare. Instead of a vulnerable, isolated, and failing beachhead, they saw a sprawling, mechanized metropolis rising aggressively from the surf. Hundreds of massive Liberty ships and LSTs dotted the water as far as the eye could see. They watched in stunned silence as the Allies constructed artificial mulberry harbors out of sunken concrete caissons right before their eyes, creating a deep water port on a hostile shore. An endless, unbroken stream of Sherman tanks, half-tracks, heavy artillery pieces, and supply trucks rolled continuously off the landing ramps and crawled up the bluffs toward the front lines. The sky above them vibrated continuously with the deafening drone of P-47 Thunderbolts and B-26 Marauders, operating with absolute impunity because the Luftwaffe had been completely swept from the air. The psychological shift among the prisoners was palpable and immediate. The arrogant whispers of an imminent German counterattack slowly died out, replaced by a profound, suffocating anxiety. The sheer volume of American industrial power unloading on the Normandy coast was not just visually intimidating, it was mathematically insurmountable. As the German veterans dug the graves, counting the endless waves of fresh, heavily armed American troops marching inland past the cemetery, their initial defiance completely crumbled. They realized that their high command had lied to them. The Third Reich, already battered in the east, could not possibly compete with this staggering level of mechanized production and logistical mastery. The grueling labor on the bluffs became a front-row seat to their own inevitable national defeat. As the front line violently expanded beyond the coastal bluffs, the logistical requirements of the Graves Registration Service drastically escalated. The combat units were pushing deeper into the claustrophobic bocage country, a lethal labyrinth of ancient, impenetrable hedgerows, and into the flooded marshlands of the Murderette River, where the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had been scattered during their chaotic night drops. The quartermasters could not simply wait on the beach for the battlefield to be sanitized and secured. They had to actively follow the advancing infantry to recover the isolated paratroopers, glider pilots, and riflemen who had fallen miles away from the organized assembly points. This required deploying highly mobile recovery teams directly into contested, uncleared territory, and they brought their captive workforce of German laborers with them. The American clerks and the POWs were forced to step off the relatively secure plateau of Saint Laurent and into an environment saturated with unseen, lethal threats. The retreating Wehrmacht had systematically laced the hedgerows, dirt crossroads, and farm fields with thousands of hidden explosives. Unexploded artillery shells, tripwired mortar rounds, the dreaded S-mines known as bouncing Bettys, and sophisticated shoe mines, wooden anti-personnel devices specifically designed to evade American metal detectors, littered the recovery zones. Navigating this lethal obstacle course fundamentally altered the dynamic between the American guards and the German prisoners. The sheer physical danger of the environment demanded a tense, unspoken reliance on the enemy. The quartermaster teams frequently found themselves relying directly on captured, hastily translated Wehrmacht minefield maps to plot their recovery routes through the thick vegetation. In some desperate instances, the American commanders explicitly ordered the German prisoners to take the lead, utilizing the POWs' first-hand knowledge of their own defensive doctrines and explosive tactics to identify likely booby traps and hidden mine clusters before the recovery teams walked into them. The tension in the hedgerows was excruciating. Every step, off the paved road to reach a fallen paratrooper entangled in a tree or a rifleman lying in a ditch carried the acute risk of sudden dismemberment. A hidden tripwire strung across a narrow country lane did not distinguish between an American quartermaster seeking a dog tag and a German prisoner carrying a canvas stretcher. They were bound together by the immediate, indiscriminate threat of high explosives. Operating in the humid, oppressive confines of the bocage, the teams worked under constant, extreme stress. The sharp crack of distant sniper fire and the sudden, terrifying whistle of incoming mortar shells served as a constant, deadly reminder that they were conducting forensic administration in the exact middle of a highly active war zone. Through this grueling combination of American administrative precision and German manual labor, the quartermasters successfully recovered and processed thousands of casualties in the opening weeks of the campaign. As long as a soldier possessed his metal dog tags and his body remained relatively intact, the strict protocols of the St. Laurent Cemetery guaranteed that his identity would be preserved, his exact location mapped, and his family properly notified. The logistical system, forged in absolute chaos, was actually holding together against impossible odds. But the brutal, mechanized reality of modern warfare was about to expose a catastrophic flaw in their immaculate field manuals. The extreme explosive violence of heavy artillery, mortar barrages, and blazing tank engagements did not always leave a body intact, nor did it always leave the dog tag securely chained to a neck. As the transport trucks began delivering canvas shrouds containing remains that were entirely unrecognizable, missing their identification tags entirely due to blast trauma, the graves registration teams hit a terrifying wall. They suddenly realized that simply digging perfectly aligned holes and logging metal discs was no longer enough. The fundamental promise to never bury an unknown was on the verge of being permanently broken. To prevent these unidentifiable casualties from vanishing into permanent anonymity, the quartermasters had to instantly pivot from physical logistics to advanced field forensics, setting up makeshift laboratories right in the Normandy mud. When a soldier arrived without his metal tags, the American clerks became combat detectives. They meticulously searched for faint, stenciled laundry marks hidden inside the collars of shredded field jackets, and utilized specialized kits to pull usable fingerprints from rigid hands. When visual identification was impossible, they painstakingly charted dental records by flashlight, cross-referencing silver amalgams and extractions with medical files urgently requested from base commands. It was an agonizing, scientifically rigorous process, driven by the desperate need to secure a name. But the administrative pressure was about to abruptly double. The War Department operated under a strict mandate dictated by international law. The Graves Registration Service was legally required to process and bury enemy combatants with the exact same bureaucratic precision as their own. The German prisoners, already exhausted from excavating American plots, were now ordered to dig adjacent, identically measured trenches for their own fallen comrades. For the American clerks, this created an immense psychological burden. They were forced to apply their exhaustive forensic standards to Wehrmacht casualties, meticulously logging German identification tags and sealing enemy letters from home into standardized pouches. They had to maintain perfect, objective bureaucratic equality for the very men who had just killed their friends, all while knowing American families back home were desperately waiting for answers. Yet, through this forced collaboration of forensic science and captive labor, the grid lines relentlessly expanded. As the forensic files piled up and the wooden crosses multiplied, the bloody coastal battlefield was quietly transforming into something entirely different. Within mere days, the culmination of this grueling, synchronized effort manifested on the bluffs of Colville-sur-Mer. The St. Laurent Temporary Cemetery rapidly expanded to its massive, planned capacity, consuming the plateau with mathematical finality. Over 4,000 bodies, American and German, had been processed, identified, and interred in this single, sprawling location. What had been a desperate, chaotic scramble to recover the dead had solidified into a vast, silent city of perfectly aligned wooden markers stretching out across the French soil in rigid, geometric precision. The sheer scale of the completed site was staggering, especially considering it had been dug almost entirely by by the physical labor of the defeated enemy. The quartermasters had meticulously plotted every single grave on official military coordinate grids. Thousands of individuals were permanently locked into a bureaucratic map, ensuring their exact location was definitively known to the War Department. The contrast on the ground was surreal and deeply unsettling. Here, on the quiet bluffs overlooking the English Channel, the quartermasters had established an immaculate, perfectly ordered environment of absolute stillness and clinical administration. Yet, just a few miles inland, the air still violently vibrated with the chaotic, mechanized roar of the ongoing Normandy campaign. The war was actively destroying lives just over the horizon, while right here, the logistical machinery had successfully frozen the immediate aftermath into perfectly measured rows. The overwhelming backlog had been cleared, the temporary graves were sealed, the final effects bags were tagged for shipment back to the United States, and the administrative ledgers were closed. The final paperwork was stamped, the trenches filled, and the coordinates secured, permanently locking these fallen men into the map of Europe. Those exact coordinates, staked out in the dirt by exhausted German prisoners and meticulously logged by American quartermasters, did not just map a temporary battlefield expedient. They laid the unalterable geographical and bureaucratic foundation for the permanent Normandy American Cemetery that overlooks Omaha Beach today. The pristine rows of white marble crosses and stars of David that millions of visitors walk past now are directly anchored to the frantic, muddy grids established in the third week of June, 1944. It perfectly encapsulates the profound paradox of industrial warfare. The combatant nations had engineered a terrifying military machine optimized for mass mechanical destruction. Yet, in direct defiance of that slaughter, the military mobilized an immense, systematic, bureaucratic apparatus designed solely to preserve the individual human dignity of every single fallen soldier. Because of the grueling physical labor and the obsessive adherence to administrative procedure on those coastal bluffs, the sacred pledge was kept. Families across the United States would not just receive a vague telegram stating their son was missing. They received the mathematically precise location of his grave, along with the intensely personal effects recovered from the sand. The closure offered to a grieving nation was undeniably achieved, permanently locking an entire generation's sacrifice into history. But as we reflect on the flawless, serene beauty of the modern cemetery, it forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable historical image, acknowledging the jarring reality of exactly whose hands were forced into the earth to secure that final peace. The men who gave their lives breaking Hitler's Atlantic Wall were ultimately laid to rest in French soil by the very soldiers they had just defeated. In the end, the American military's sacred promise to its fallen heroes was fulfilled, paradoxically, through the grueling labor of a captive enemy. It remains one of the most profound ironies of the Normandy campaign. The enduring foundation for America's most revered overseas sanctuary was physically carved out of the earth by the hands of the Wehrmacht.